Hello and welcome to the Beacon Salon Lecture Series. The Salon Lecture Series is an educational outreach program of Beacon College in Leesburg, Florida. Beacon is a nonprofit liberal arts school and America's first accredited baccalaureate institution dedicated to educating students primarily with learning disabilities, ADHD, and other learning differences. In its third season, the Beacon Salon Lecture Series presents 5 lectures from September to March, featuring Beacon College faculty addressing compelling subjects in their respective liberal arts fields. This episode focuses on those invisible literary characters who are hiding in plain sight. Literature is sometimes filled with examples of characters that we only catch a glimpse of, meet only in passing, or sometimes never encounter at all. From Hamlet's ghostly father to Beckett's Godot to Harry Potter's parents, stories are sometimes populated with shadowy individuals that, while we may never meet them directly, we nonetheless can learn a great deal about them and the heroes or villains that they share a connection with. The artistic reasons for creating unseen characters can vary wildly. Whether it's the writer's intentions, the devices of the genre, or even the period of time a work was written in, unseen characters cast a unique shadow on literary works, past and present. This presentation will examine some of these unseen personalities and consider the effects these literary ghosts have had on readers' minds. Leading us on that journey is Christopher Irving. Christopher J. Irving is an instructor of humanities and English at Beacon College. He holds a Master's of Fine Arts degree in creative fiction and nonfiction with a focus on sci-fi and fantasy literature from the English department of Florida Atlantic University. And he holds a bachelor's degree in English literature and film and multimedia communication, also from FAU. Irving has been quoted recently on Pop Culture and Film Matters by the Palm Beach Post, Entertainment Weekly, Mashable, the Washington Times, the Christian Science Monitor, International Cinematographers Guild magazine, Variety, Voice of America, and the Daily Gazette. And now, the Beacon Salon Lecture Series presents Christopher Irving.
Today we're going to be talking about elusive and unseen literary characters. Characters exist in all different types. There are heroes, they're protagonists, they're villains, they're the enemies, they're background characters, they're detailed. They can exist in all different forms and all different shapes. But there are some types of literary characters that we don't give too much attention to, and those are going to be the focus for today's discussion. So this is Hiding in Plain Sight from the Beacon Salon series, and thank you for joining us. The first thing to do for unseen and elusive character types is to provide some type of a definition for them. If we look at this, a working definition might be that an unseen or an elusive character is a fictional character that does exist within a story, but they operate indirectly within the story. So they're not exactly in the background. They're not these fuzzy, oblique shapes that occur in the background of a story. They are people who have a significant influence on the overall narrative of what it is that you're reading or that you're being told. These character types, they fit no clear classification or category of character. So while we might often think of them as villains or as heroes, they sort of blend the line between the exact type of characterization that they are. Furthermore, they're often richly described through indirect description. That is to say, the main protagonist of a story or the secondary characters often provide them the most insight to a reader. So we don't learn about them directly. We learn about them indirectly from the other characters within the story, even if they are significant characters. Now, if we had to provide some sort of like a map for this, an indirect or an elusive character type could easily fall into one of two different routes. The first one is the simplest one. The method of introduction for, let's say, an unmet character like Godot from Samuel Beckett's play would be one that never appears directly within the narrative, never appears directly within the story itself. Now, this type of character can be easily understood as the truly unmet character type. because we learn nothing about them except through other people. We never get any physical description of them, and if we do, it's often very minimal. The second method of introduction for what we might consider a more elusive character type would be a type of character that does appear directly in the narrative, but only eventually. We may meet them at the very beginning, we may meet them at the very end, but we don't meet them consistently throughout the narrative. In other words, they're not going to end up being in every chapter. They can, however, form into what can be considered round or flat or dynamic character types. And we can dub this type of character the elusive character. But again, an important distinction with this is that these are not background characters. They don't exist on the margins. These are not people that are popping up only once throughout a story and never appear again. No, they have a much more significant impact on the story itself. And for that reason, I think a new designation is necessary for them. And again, we call it the elusive character type. Now, whether they're unmet or whether they're elusive character types, they do have different functions within a narrative, within a story, that is. The first one being is that elusive or unmet character types, they often provide our protagonists with some sort of a goal, some type of an objective. They need to defeat someone, they need to rescue someone, they need to find someone, if it's like a long-lost father, for instance. They have some type of connection with the primary characters within the story itself. And they're usually portrayed as indirect antagonists, even if they don't end up becoming antagonists in the story itself. We might think of them as the bad guys, but then that belief might end up being completely turned around on us. Another function within the narrative, whether again they're unmet or elusive character types, is that they operate as literary devices within the story itself. They could be a symbol, they could give us a sense of the motif that is consistent without the story or within the story. They could give us a sense of the overall tone. They can operate as metaphors, for instance. A character that is, let's say, a corrupt preacher who lives in the Deep South is a representation, a symbolic representation of religious practices having run amok. A person who was an unmet or an elusive character who was once a former king might be thought of as the person who was the best type of leadership that the land had ever known. But we don't ever have to meet these characters to learn that type of thing about them. Another function that elusive or unmet character types have within a narrative is that they enhance the overall characteristics of the genre. And they do this in very different ways, and it really depends upon the nature of the story itself. One of the ways might be that they prolong a sense of anxiety. If the meeting of a character is something that the reader is dreading as they read every single page and every single chapter of the story, some sort of like built-up anxiety is going to gradually begin to develop, because the meeting of them is what Alfred Hitchcock referred to as the ticking of the bomb. Suspense is generated by the ticking of the bomb, not by the bomb itself going off. So when a character is unmet or is elusive within a narrative, often anxiety is provoked in both the reader and in the other characters, which stronger or further enhances your connection with the characters that you're identifying with. Another aspect of an unmet or an elusive character is that they often reinforce and sometimes subvert the audience's expectations. We don't think that the person we're going to meet eventually is going to always defy our expectations, but sometimes they do. A perfect example of this is when Luke Skywalker was told, "I am your father," by Darth Vader. He completely subverted our expectations, because in those stories, we had long been told that Anakin Skywalker was dead. What a surprise to find out that Darth Vader is actually the biological father of the primary protagonist in that story. And that's just a visual example of what an indirect, better yet, an elusive character type can do to subvert the audience's expectations. Often it comes as a big surprise. Now, some of the traits and limitations of these unseen or elusive character types, there's several different ways that this can manifest itself. The first thing is, as I've said before, there's a huge distinction between an elusive or an unseen character and a background character. Background characters pop up. They might, for example, be like the pub owner in some work of 19th century British fiction. They might, for example, be the butler or the housemaid, or the crazy Aunt Sue who lives out in Nebraska. These people can appear within a narrative consistently, but they don't have a significant impact on its overall arching effect. and they certainly don't have an overall impact on the characters themselves, at least not a significant one. But unseen and elusive characters can, even though we don't see them for the majority of the story that we're being told. They also usually have an established identity, which is kind of odd because if a character is unseen or truly unmet, even Godot had a name. But elusive characters that we don't see consistently throughout a story, they often have a name, a history, physical characteristics, physical descriptions, and we're often told these things in sometimes enormous quantities, and sometimes in also very small quantities. It may happen at one part of the narrative, it may happen in the later part of the narrative. We're going to see some examples of all of those as we go further. But in any case, their identities are usually known, or at the least case, inevitably revealed, which is one way to distinguish them from background characters that are given a name and then have little impact on the story itself. Another limitation of unseen or elusive character types, they often fit the unreliable narrative form. What we learn about them, we often can't trust. So if a story is being told in the first person by the hero, the elusive or the unseen villain that they're pursuing, we only have the protagonist's perspective to rely upon, which often is not reliable. That person may not be honest with themselves. They may not be honest with themselves. They may not, for instance, be telling us everything they know, and they also may not know everything about these unseen or elusive characters in the first place. They only gather this information as they go. Now, different genres have different ways of manifesting this, but in any case, what we learn about them is often unclear at first. It gains momentum as a narrative progresses. And this is why they're often unreliable in terms of a narrative discussion. Another thing about them, and I think this is probably the most interesting point or interesting limitation for an unseen or elusive character, they are often not the primary interest of the author who has created them. Now, the author may have written this person, given them a name, and let them have a significant contribution on the story that's being told. But very often is the case, and in some of the examples we're going to see, the author creates them for those purposes and really nothing further. They're not sometimes even given any dialogue. They have no significant part to play in the story itself, but their impact on the story can be significant. In cases such as this, the side characters, the primary characters, are often the primary focus of the author's intention. So they're more interested in, let's say, the heroes than the elusive antagonist who's skulking around in the background somewhere. And that's why these people operate sometimes as either symbols or motifs of the narrative. One first example of this, and I'm going to go in chronologically order with this, would be Satan from the Inferno of the Divine Comedy. Satan is only seen in the very last canto, that is to say part of the epic poem. That's Canto 34. This is the William Blake depiction of Satan as he appears to both Dante and Virgil. He's entrapped in a river of ice, and his wings are flapping, creating a windmill-like effect that's been chilling all the underlayers of the different levels of purgation. So he only appears in the final canto, as I said, Canto 34, doesn't even say anything, doesn't offer one word to our two heroes of this story, or protagonists, I should say, to Dante and Virgil, doesn't engage with them in any way, but he's been there the entire time. His presence has been felt throughout the narrative. His omnipresence has been witnessed and felt by both Dante and Virgil, as well as all the other sinners that are in the different layers of hell. They've talked about him indirectly, they've described him, and they've even told Dante and Virgil where he is as they descend these levels of purgation. But when we finally meet him, it's rather underwhelming. In fact, Dante himself is a little taken aback by how underwhelming it is to meet someone as significant as Satan in person. They climb down his back, in fact. But his description is really all we get physically of Satan in the epic poem. And this is from the John Chiardi translation. He writes that, and this gross fiend and image of all evil, who made a stairway for us with his hide, is pinched and prisoned in the ice pack still. And there's a really great depiction of this in the Gustave Doré 1868 illustration. You can see that Satan there is encapsulated in the ice, and Dante and Virgil, who are on the precipice, end up climbing down around his back. It's interesting to note that not only does he not speak with the primary characters, he doesn't even really seem to be too interested that they're there. he seems to be somewhat resigned to his fate. So here's a significant character that's responsible for everything that we see in Dante's Inferno, regardless of the translation. His influence is profound. Yet when we finally meet him, he seems rather bored and disinterested, almost as if he's just scrolling endlessly through social media and finding nothing of interest. So there's one example. A second example would be Hamlet's father from William Shakespeare's play Hamlet. And that's the Thomas Ridgway Gould's illustration that I think perfectly shows the image of the ghost as he's first seen on the ramparts of the castle. Now, the ghost is symbolically important as an elusive and an unseen character for several reasons. First of all, he's the king. The king is meant to be the representation of the supreme authority of the land. He's also Hamlet's father. So that paternal connection to the primary protagonist of the story is significant. He's the person who not just gave him life, but is potentially leading him to his own death. And that leads us to his questionable motives. We're not really ever certain what Hamlet's ghost, that is to say Hamlet's father, what his motives are. At some point, he seems to be indicating to his son that he wants only revenge. At other points, it seems to be that he's tempting his son into committing some type of sin for reasons perhaps of not defending him while he was alive. And then for other reasons, it might be just to shame and guilt his brother Claudius, as well as his now ex-wife Gertrude. One of the other impacts that this mostly elusive character has in the play is that it constantly questions Hamlet's own sanity. He has a growing distrust of his own faith and what it is that he's thinking. In fact, he has to put on the play in Hamlet in order to determine if his uncle is going to have any type of reaction from seeing the way in which his father was poisoned. So there's a theme and a symbol that he's representing. And then last but not least, this one is significant because it shows that even in a spiritual level, a spectral level, a character that's mostly elusive throughout a narrative, even if it's a play, can still have a significant impact on the character, because every other character in the play does nothing but discuss Hamlet's ghost. And we only meet him four times throughout the play, and never once when he's alive, which makes him a pretty profound, elusive character type. Another example that everyone's always really familiar with is the creature from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And that's the Theodore von Holst steel engraving for the American edition, the 1831 edition. This is an interesting elusive character type because it fits all of these parameters of this definition that we've discussed so far. The creature is first seen because Victor Frankenstein, in his narrative, describes how he's assembled the creature. He is then unseen after his escape, and we hear nothing from the creature any further. He's also unknown because Victor has a growing paranoia in his mind of what this creature is up to, where he's gone, and what evil he might do upon the world, or what revenge he might take on Victor Frankenstein himself. And then when the creature is finally revealed, it does nothing but completely subvert our expectations. Victor himself is expecting some large, disgusting brute who can barely speak and is violently destructive. And what he finds is a very well articulate and highly philosophical creature that he's created, who is ashamed of his quote-unquote father for giving him life without purpose. So he also fits what we might consider a paradoxical, elusive character in that he, again, subverts our expectations for what we're expecting. We're looking for a monster, and what we find is a form of philosopher. And also, it subverts Victor Frankenstein's expectations as well. He's expecting the same thing that we are. And for this reason, the connection between the character of Victor Frankenstein and the reader is one of sort of unnecessary prejudice towards the antagonist, or what we perceive as the antagonist in the story, which turns out to be, many people end up rooting for the Frankenstein monster as the story goes on. Another famous example of this, and this one is proof that an elusive character doesn't always need to be human in form, or I don't know if you can really qualify Frankenstein as human, but Ahab's prize, that is Moby Dick from Herman Melville's novel. Moby Dick is a symbolic representation of both nature's fury, and he's written to be physically elusive, but also psychologically elusive from the point of view of Ahab. Ahab is willing to see this whale in his soup, and he sees them on every single crest of every single horizon, which is part of the reason why the ship in the story continues to go further and further, almost to the point where it feels like they're going to go off the edge of the world. Ahab's pursuit of this elusive character is not just driving him to madness, it's also driving him and his crew to the far end of the world. And the danger that this whale represents is probably not as serious as Ahab initially thought. At least that's what the crew thinks. But as the story reveals itself in the ending, the whale is indeed exceptionally dangerous. But again, this is an elusive, symbolic representation of an elusive character. And the whale itself is described as thou all-destroying but not unconquering whale, which is part of the reason why Ahab feels so justified in further pursuing it. And it is also a non-human, anthropomorphic depiction of an elusive character type. Another more well-known example, Count Dracula. We only meet Count Dracula in the first 4 chapters of the novel. After that, he turns into a bat, a wolf, a younger version of himself, and then eventually, as a monster, into the story's conclusion. Now, this is an interesting, elusive character type because he fits multiple alternating perspective. Dracula was written in a form of writing at the time that was popular called an epistolary fiction. It's told through Jonathan Harker's journals, it's told through Mina Harker's diary, it's told through Dr. Seward's phonographic record. But what we learn about Dracula is so indirect and so alternating because it's told from multiple perspectives that at the end of it, we can barely rely upon anything that we learn about this character. He's never given a narrative of his own. So meeting Dracula is like first meeting 10 people who need to introduce you to Dracula. His physical description is mentioned mostly in the first 4 chapters of the novel. After that, we really don't learn too much about him. But we learn that he's, the classic depiction of a vampire, more like the Bela Lugosi type. A tall old man, clad in black from head to foot, strong-faced, very, very arched nostrils, sort of looks, a little dangerous, a little creepy. But Jonathan Harker mentions that he has the impression that this person has been so old that he's kind of outlived life itself. So that's, maybe the richest description that we've gotten from an elusive character, at least of the examples that we've seen so far. His personality, however, is so much more elusive than that. What we learn about Dracula's characterization, mostly in Jonathan Harker's journal, tells us a great deal about his personality type. And the Count tells Jonathan Harker at dinner, in conversation, that there is no reason that all things are as they are. And did you not see with my eyes and know with my knowledge, you would perhaps better understand. It's highly suggestive for this elusive character that there's more to his personality and to his sense of history and his own sense of himself than meets the eye. Of course, Harker never investigates what the Count is telling him any further. He instead then starts to think of him as the enemy. But having a conversation might be somewhat more revealing than we might first think. For elusive character types, and this also qualifies for unseen character types, we have also the great benefactor as well as George Orwell's example with Big Brother. We never meet Big Brother directly, and we meet the great benefactor from Yevgeny Zamyatin's narrative We, his 1932 novel. We only meet him twice, once at the beginning and once at the end. Now, these both unseen and elusive character types are interesting because while we don't ever get to engage with them too directly in the stories that are being told, they're both nameless in that they don't have a proper name. In fact, Big Brother may not even actually exist in the story itself, but they're faceless. Very scant physical description is ever provided for them. But these are 2 characterizations that have total control over their environments, whether it be Oceania or whether it be the One State. These are worlds that they hold in complete arbitrary power and total totalitarian control. And no one can question them. In fact, no one can even get near them, because in the narrative, they either don't appear or they appear only twice. Both of these, the great benefactor in Yevgeny Zamyatin's We and Big Brother in George Orwell's 1984, both of them also transcend the boundaries of what might be considered normal humanity. We start to think of them as godlike, as the characters in the story do. They are the people that hold complete power over every decision that gets made, every thought that gets thought out, and every single idea that a person can even begin to look at. So they're godlike in their omnipotence and in their power. A more recent example, the most recent yet, is the Dark Lord from The Lord of the Rings. The all-seeing eye from J.R.R. Tolkien's novel. We're never introduced to this character in physical form. We're only introduced to him as a presence. So while he easily fits the unseen character type, the completely unseen character type, he's also elusive, because around the chapters in the various books of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, he does make appearances, but in a non-humanoid form, and not even a physical form. He's the all-seeing eye, the sense of pervading evil that exists within the woods. And he's never once given any physical description in the novels themselves. Now, the future of both unseen and elusive character types is very difficult to gauge. On the one hand, we have extended universes which are creating more and more information about characters who, as we were growing up, we initially learned very little about. On the other hand, people are being more detailed in the types of fiction that they're creating. So I don't know if unseen or elusive character types are going to continue in literature, at least as significantly as they did in the first 200 years where novels were sort of in their heyday, but they might. And I think, if anything, perhaps they should. Elusive and unseen character types always provide that unmet goal that a character can try to reach. It's something that gives the heroes in a story, or even the villains, something to attain that's always going to be continuously out of grip. And if that's created, then the stories might always have a direction to go in. So that's the presentation, and thank you very, very much.
Christopher, thank you for that insightful and thoughtful presentation. Would you like to follow up with your own questions or your own observations for Christopher Irving? Feel free to send your questions or comments to beaconsalon@beaconcollege.edu. That concludes this installment of the Beacon Salon Lecture Series. When we meet again, Dr. Nikki Nance will seriously approach the topic, Sarcasm as a Second Language. Visit the Beacon College website at beaconcollege.edu/salon for the latest up-to-date listing on when the program will premiere. Until then, I'm Darrell Owens. Thank you for joining us.